Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
Thanks, Brad. This season, we have an incredible lineup of stories that we cannot wait to share. In part one of the season one opener, our partner Alex Thiersch was able to share his actual first client's experience and the painful discovery that client had of realizing that her medical spa is the practice of medicine. I know I can't wait to see what happens next. So, Brad, let's start part two of this journey.
Alex, you just told us the story about how medspa was started, which is really cool. I've heard it multiple times, but every time you actually tell it's great. I can tell the passion that you still have and how excited you are for what this organization has become. But I understand it. I assume there's just one case of this one nurse wasn't the only investigation that you came across, and it was not unique in any capacity.
No, not at all. It was, and so there's 2 points to be made there. One is that the investigation itself was fairly unique, simply because there wasn't a lot of enforcement, and there still isn't. So the fact that she was being investigated, I think, came as a shock to her and a lot of the people in the industry that she knew, simply because there hadn't been a lot of enforcement. But the way that she was operating was not only, not unique, but it was overwhelmingly the standard. I mean, that's how everybody did it. There was absolutely, and this is really where, how this all started, is that it was clear there was no common institutional knowledge about how this should all work. So you had from, the surgeons to the nurses to estheticians, all of them operating relatively in the dark as far as what they could and could not do, what the structure would be, and you can find these answers, like if you dig into it, but it's virtually impossible for a non-lawyer who doesn't know where to look to figure out what the rules of the road were for this industry. And back then it was even more, amorphous. So it was the overwhelming standard, and we put it at like 80 to 85% back then. It was probably even higher than that, but 80 to 90% of med spas were operating totally illegally back then. And so that was really what we sought out to solve, was to try to get them the information so they could operate legally.
And was there a theme you started seeing as to, like, what are the things that you need to do to operate legally? Maybe I'll throw this to you, to Michael.
Sure. Yeah. We had, and all three of us have given this speech a million times, and we talk about the three-legged stool. We do so because it really is the foundational things that you have to talk about to be compliant when you set up a med spa. I think before we can even get to the three-legged stool, I want to start with the most fundamental thing is you can sort through how you're regulated by looking first at the services you provide in your business. And if those services are considered medical, it's a game changer. It changes the governing body and how you're licensed or how you're regulated in every state virtually. And so if you have medical services, that's where we get into the three-legged stool. And just at a high level, the three legs of the stool are first ownership. Brad or Alex both kind of touched on this idea of the corporate practice of medicine earlier. These are rules that regulate who can own a business that provides medical services. The second leg of the stool is the diagnosis and treatment plan. And at a really high level, this is who has the scope of practice to have someone come in and say, yes, this treatment or that treatment is appropriate, and is able to give a treatment plan to that patient. And then the final piece, the final leg of the stool is who can do it. Once you have a treatment plan, who actually has the scope of practice to provide the service. And, this of course does vary state by state.
And you one of the questions I guess I have back to you or Alex, why is it a three-legged stool?
Why is it a three-legged stool?
Yeah.
Well, because if you kick one out, then the whole thing falls over. Is that right?
There you go. Just want to make sure we're all together in this one.
Brad and his cute analogies.
Yes.
Yeah, no, definitely. You should tweet that out, Brad. That's a good one. The thing that's interesting about what you said, Mike, I mean, this is all kind of common knowledge to us, and it's becoming more common knowledge in the industry. But I remember when I first really started looking into this, I mean, and I read the entire Nurse Practice Act. I read the entire Medical Practice Act, the Medical Corporations Act. I read all the rules and the regs because I was self-taught at this point, and I had someone to ask questions to. But I remember when I first I made that connection that you just made, which is the minute you start practicing medicine, it changes all of this. And for me, that was it all crystallized because I was like, it's so obvious that what they're doing, injectables, injecting lips, they were doing a blade of lasers back then with just an RN doing it, right? And it was so clear and obvious. They were using IVs. They were prescribing, drugs. It was so obvious that this was medical treatment, but for some reason, this industry, and I'm not even blaming the practitioners because they didn't know any better, but for some reason, this industry had grown up kind of as an offshoot and just had totally developed itself as non-medical in the way that it was operating, even though it clearly was medical. So the first step in all this was just going to people and saying, you are practicing medicine and therefore you're regulated the same as the doctor down the street. And just even saying that was enough to make people fall out of their chairs and look at me like I was an alien.
And I'll just add on to that, even our surgeon clients to this day see this almost as non-medical. And I think in their brains, because it's non-invasive and they're not operating on someone, they don't see it the same way. And so I'm still surprised that some of the people that seem least informed about these issues of these being medical services are our surgeons, our plastic surgeons, even our derms. I mean, it's interesting.
And so now we all can agree on this podcast that is the practice of medicine. We've established there's a three-legged stool. I want to dive a little bit deeper into the first leg, which you started talking about, which is this state law concept about the corporate practice of medicine and ownership. Maybe, Alex, you want to take this first jump in there about really give the audience an understanding of what does that mean as far as the definition.
Yeah. So in some ways it's the natural starting point and it's the first step that we always go to because it's kind of the foundation, but it's also, the one where people aren't really getting in trouble as much for that, at least, and historically it's been the same way. But the way the corporate practice of medicine works was, and I remember I remembered the day I found that term and I Googled it and then I spent hours looking at it. And I remember thinking, everything just kind of went sideways for me because everything I knew about this industry was completely backwards. And the way the corporate practice of medicine works is that, corporations can't practice medicine, doctors practice medicine. And so the main thing that impacts the med spa industry is that corporations that are not owned by doctors can't employ doctors. And as you know, from everything that in what we do nowadays, the prevailing structure of a med spa back then, and arguably even still today in some states, is you'll have a non-doctor own the company and then enter into a contract with a medical director as a doctor. And that in and of itself violates the corporate practice of medicine because only doctors can own medical facilities. That's the core rule. Doctors can own medical facilities and non-doctors cannot employ doctors. Really, those are the things that it means in a nutshell.
And so if that's the case, Michael, does that mean doctors must own med spas?
So from a state perspective, the states fall into there's basically three different buckets that they fall into. So again, we're going to say medical spa. I'm going to just pause for a moment and say a medical spa is the same thing as a medical practice. If you're going to your doctor's office, they're governed in the same way as a medical spa that you walk into that's, part of a retail center. And so this rule applies for both. And what you'll find across the country is that they will either fall into one bucket that says only doctors can own businesses that practice medicine. Or the second bucket is non-doctors can own a part of the business that practices medicine, but there's strings attached, including the idea that doctors are usually one of the owners, if not the majority owner, usually. And then the final is a very small sample of states that say anyone can own a business that practices medicine. So you'll see that the biggest example is Florida, but Ohio, we've just talked about, also has the same rule. And so the corporate practice of medicine, or CPOM, which is coincidentally Brad's rapper name that he uses on the weekends.
And his tattoo on his bicep.
Obviously.
That CPOM does not apply in those states. And so you don't have to worry about that leg of the stool.
All right. Well, I'm really confused, Michael. And this is not, I mean, those who know me, I'm confused easily. So I'm confused in the sense of, I know in states like Texas or New York, where I hear that these major companies are there and they own med spas.
Okay. Well, I know you did that on purpose and that you're trying to throw me off sides with a topic that could probably break into two separate podcasts, and we won't do that. There are two major things that I think can just give you some assurance for this leg of the stool. If you're out there, you're not a doctor and you own a med spa and wondering, what in the world do I do with this information? So the first thing I'll say is there is absolutely a solution. The most common business model in the med spa space across the country is the MSO model, the Management Services Organization model. That's how all the chain med spas operate. That's how non-doctors do business in a medical practice setting. And so there is a solution, and it probably is its own episode to talk about, how do you implement the MSO model in a way that works both from a regulatory compliance perspective, but also from a business perspective. And then the second thing is that there's this growing thing of nurse practitioner autonomy around the country. And I know there's probably some nurse practitioners listening to this saying, what about me? And the main thing I want to say is, yes, we hear you. And yes, you may be able to own your own med spa depending on where you are. But it is a really controversial and gray area topic around the country, and merits its own conversation.
Perfect. Well, and I think that goes back to, and you both were addressing this earlier, but I really want to concentrate on this one piece: is why is there so much confusion on the difference between a med spa and a medical practice? And Alex, I'm going to start with you first.
Well, I think it's a good question. And I would love to kind of one of these days dig into that further and go back to some of the OGs from the CPOM days and really figure out kind of how this started, because I don't know that I know the exact answer. What I think is that, because the term medical spa started being used, and I'm not even sure where that term came from. I mean, that was been around since 2001 or even before, but it really kind of comes down to that, because it's although these are medical treatments, and that much is clear to us as the industry was born and grew up, they really weren't, the facilities and the environment were not the same as a medical office. So you didn't have, you had a lot more nice facilities. It was more relaxing. It was much more like a salon or a spa than it was a medical facility. The treatments, as you already mentioned, were non-invasive. So, it's not a traditional doctor's office. And I think that at some point along the development and evolution of med spas, it just switched over to this other thought process. And once that happened, and once, then you started getting some of the big pharma coming in, and they were, pumping money and product into the industry. It just kind of grew up that way. But it definitely is the biggest impediment that we have had as an association and as an entire industry is just that basic concept, is that we're practicing medicine. And the more that we can convey that, the better off we're going to be.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I think that, the term medical spa was a branding term. And I think that clearly the experience that these med spas try to have people experience is akin to a spa experience. I think that's why they name it that. That's why it has that retail feel to it. And to a degree, it worked. Like, it worked so well that people don't realize it's actually a medical practice. And so you see confusion out there, not just with consumers, but with regulating bodies, people that are trying to enforce these. They normally put these in the same bucket as a spa.
Yeah, in some ways, it's a testament to the branding and the marketing done by the kind of the early pioneers who were doing this, because they did a phenomenal job. And this is where it's almost impossible to get into this without talking about plastic surgery and aesthetic marketing, because it all blends together. Because as you started to market aesthetic services in general, it really blurred the line from a business sense between a regular normal business and marketing and revenue collection and a medical practice. It really became, the lines were blurred. I think the one thing that bothers me now, and it doesn't bother me anymore, but like the term medical spa, there was this movement back in the mid 2000s, right when I started, where the prevailing thought was that we were going to move in that more spa direction. It would be there would be a hybrid between a spa and a medical practice. You'd have massage, you'd have, waterfall. And really that hasn't materialized as much as people thought. It's gone much more the medical route, and it's gone much more towards efficiency and getting people the treatments, the medical treatments that they need. And the spa services have kind of have fallen off the wayside a little bit.
Perfect. Well, that's establishing we got one solid leg now. For those who are listening, hopefully you all agree that it's a practice of medicine and that you have to comply with that particular ownership control rule. So let's move to the next one, which is diagnosis and treatment plan, which is we often refer to as the med spa widowmaker, because this one appears to get people most in trouble. And maybe, Alex, I'd love for you to jump in there and really talk about why the diagnosis, coming up with a diagnosis and treatment plan, is so important in this industry.
Yeah, it's I think by far the most important issue that we are dealing with right now from a PR perspective and from folks getting in trouble perspective, in that, the minute you start practicing medicine, which we've established that we are, in order to do that, a few things have to happen. Most notably, there has to be somebody who makes a diagnosis and a treatment plan, somebody who understands and says, okay, this is what's wrong with this person, here's how we're going to treat it. And that has to be a doctor. It can't be an RN. It can't be an esthetician. It can't be an LPN, anything like that. Doctors practice medicine. And again, if you get back to that underlying point, it kind of all makes sense. So what the face-to-face exams means, and I might have skipped ahead a little bit there, but generally speaking, in order to make a diagnosis and a treatment plan, there has to be a face-to-face consultation between the patient and the doctor. That's like the underlying baseline rule. And that's, again, because we're practicing medicine and only a doctor can do the diagnosis and treatment plan. So what we found very early on was that piece was rarely, if ever, happening in medical spas. It was RNs who, it should be noted, are very competent injectors, oftentimes better injectors than the physicians themselves, right? So you've got an RN who has been doing injections, and I'm talking about, fillers and neurotoxins for years, and they know the anatomy, they know exactly what to do, they know the contraindications and how to treat complications, all that. They just started seeing patients, and they started doing Botox parties, and they would go to salons, and they would just start raking in the cash, making $20,000, $30,000 a night sometimes. And the problem is that they are practicing medicine when they do that. The minute an RN sees a new patient and treats that patient without that patient ever seeing a doctor, that critical step in the middle of the diagnosis and treatment plan by a physician has been skipped. And the problem with that is that those are real serious penalties, criminal penalties in many states, certainly, use of loss of license. And it's not just for the RN. And I think the first time that I really saw the true implications, it was not long after this first incident with the nurse that I met. Ultimately, the medical director of her med spa was also investigated. And then a second medical director from another spa was investigated and actually lost his license for 6 months because of a similar thing that he had been doing. And that's when I really saw, like, this is and again, I'm a little off topic, but it's a very serious thing that if anyone is going to fix anything after listening to this podcast that they're doing wrong, that's the first thing I would want them to fix.
Yeah, and that's a perfect example of, and because so many states that do have some version of core practice of medicine on the ownership allow anyone to own it, that does not get away from the second rule, which is why we call it the widowmaker, which is they have to make that, we call it sometimes a good faith exam of that initial patient so they can confirm that that patient is a good candidate for whatever those services are. So once we go through that process, we've made that good faith exam, we've determined that person is a good candidate. Let's go to the next leg of the stool, Michael, and then who can then render the services? Who can treat the patient?
And let me add, I want to make sure, I may have missed this, Alex, when you said it. In most states, nurse practitioners and physician assistants can do the good faith exam. We always start with that baseline rule of the MD because we know that can happen. But there's either independence or delegation and supervision rules that allow NPs and PAs to do it. And so you want to make sure you have that set. Then, as kind of touching on Brad's question, who can do it? Well, again, the MDs, the PAs, and the NPs can all perform the treatments. Obviously, they can make the diagnosis, they can carry through and do them. In most states, RNs can do them as well. I mean, and there are some states that have some weird attempted limitations on RNs, but generally speaking, you're going to be safe with an RN. It gets really state specific after that if you go down, because really at this point you're talking about LVNs or lesser degree nurses and then other form of vocational nurses, and then you're getting into non-medical providers. You're getting estheticians, medical assistants. You have people that have some sort of laser tech training. They all fall into the same bucket, which is they're not medically or nursing trained, and so it's very state specific. Some states say, "Look, doctor, we're going to trust you that you're going to make sure whoever's doing this has the appropriate training, and we're not worried about the person treating's license. And so if you're comfortable, you're the one that's going to stand before us." And then many other states say no. Like California is super clear. RN or higher can perform medical treatments. And so it just becomes really important to look at it from a state-to-state basis.
And it's interesting because as you were saying that, I was thinking back to, the mid 2000s. And as med spas were increasing, it was kind of like there was two tracks. There was, the injectables track where nurses were really learning how to do these injectables. But at the same time, you had all this technology that was being developed on the light emitting devices and lasers. And the laser industry grew so fast. And what they started doing is training people to operate these lasers. And anyone who's seen any of these lasers, they're fairly easy to operate. You just really go to a setting, hit a switch, boom, you're done. But the problem is that people started operating these things without realizing that they were not physicians and they were practicing medicine. So they were skipping both of those steps. They were skipping the face-to-face exam and then possibly skipping the proper delegation and supervision requirements where they were doing things that they weren't supposed to be doing. But it all was kind of a perfect storm of technology and money and consumer demand and gray areas and regulations that created this kind of mess that we're still trying to unsort.
All right, that's awesome, Alex. And and Michael is really understanding why it's so important that each leg of that stool needs to stand on its own. Failure for one of them to work is obviously it's going to collapse and you're going to fall down and you expose yourself, your doctor, or anyone else to potential, depending where you are, either arrest or loss of license. So it's so important for you to comply with those rules. But Alex, I kind of want to jump out of this and just jump right back into understanding where you are right now with ANSPA. And so one of the benefits of being part of ANSPA is you absolutely have lots of educational programs out there for them. But I want you to kind of dive a little bit further into what other things has ANSPA kind of kicked into higher gear in the last few, if not weeks and months.
Yeah. So, I mean, the whole ANSPA's goal always was to help people understand the rules and then hopefully create some consistency across the states with respect to the rules. So what we're doing now is we've put together what we call the model rules for medical spas. And basically it's putting what we've talked about today into clear, concise, easily digestible format that everybody can understand. So the basic rules of the three-legged stool, making everybody understand them across the states and saying, okay, as an industry, if we're going to be successful and we're going to eliminate some of the bad actors and the bad news stories and the bad PR and all that, we need to be consistent. And the truth of the matter is that as diverse and different as the states are, those core principles are relatively consistent in the way that they are, the way that they're applied. I mean, there's small differences with corporate practice of medicine and things like that, but generally speaking, you've got ownership, you've got delegation and supervision, and you've got the diagnosis and treatment in every single state, and they're mostly the same. So we're just putting that into a document which hopefully will be adopted by everybody in the industry, so we can really start getting some baseline consistency. And a rising tide will lift all boats, as they say. So that's what we're up to now, and that's kind of our that's been our focus for the last probably year. And moving forward, that's where we're going to be looking.
So before we sign off, I think the audience needs to know whatever happened to that RN that you helped in that first case.
I still know her. She's she is truly, she's got a real knack for this industry. So she is out there still doing a great job. I haven't spoken to her in probably about a year, but we connect probably about every once a year, and we check in on each other, and she's still doing great. And now she's committed to compliance. She actually has compliance is cool tattooed to her forehead.
Nice. Nice. All right. Well, let's start walking out of here in the sense of Michael, what are some of the takeaways that you can give our audience today?
Well, I started the conversation talking about walking through a trail of tears, and we have literally watched people in an audience start crying when we talk about the three-legged stool as they realize that they're not compliant. And so, there's two things. One, there's a solution. And two, you have to understand that you've chosen to get into a heavily regulated industry. Compliance is hard. And the way through it is to go through it and not around it. You have to turn into it. That's the reason AMSPA has the hashtag compliance is cool. And so, you need to have that on your forehead as well.
And Alex, no pressure here, but I'd like this answer to be so good that the mic gets dropped afterwards. So what are your conclusion? What are some takeaways you can give our audience?
No, honestly, I think Michael said it perfectly. I mean, this is, it's an incredible industry, and it's such a fun industry. And I never want people to get scared or upset when we talk to them, because there's so much potential, and there's a way to do it, and there's a way to do it correctly. We just have to get on the same page. But I mean, when you look at how fast and how much money people are making in this industry, the entire industry, I'm talking about pre-COVID, but I know we'll get right back there afterwards. It's, the sky is the limit, and we are still on the ground floor. So even if you get into it now, there's so much growth to be had in the years to come.
Awesome. Well, Alex, I really appreciate you joining us. I know that this season we're going to have a lot of cool different individuals joining us, but we couldn't think of a better guest to kick off our podcast but yourself. So thanks for being that number one guy.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm a little bit embarrassed about that, but I appreciate it nonetheless.
Thanks, man.
Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.